Right. Welcome. Good to see you again. Welcome to Andrew Dutton.
Thank you.
Welcome to Alan Kay. Just rules of engagement, so there's no misunderstanding. We are tight on time because of voting and we start a little late. So I know you do this anyway, Robert, but I will interrupt if I think that there's a waffle going on or if the question is not being directly answered, and it's only in that that I'll do so. The more we can stick to the questions, I'm sure the better the engagement will be. All right? So I'm going to start let's start by saying this, because I think there's a general understanding. We're coming at this early in the programme, and we've done this elsewhere in government with other programmes. We just talked a little bit earlier about smart meters, was a classic, where we also had a session with Devereux around the design of that programme. And I gather from members of the committee that actually our recommendations have had an impact on how they've taken that forward. So you shouldn't see this. I think we all want the programme to work unanimously around the table, and you shouldn't see this as an attack if we identify some risks this afternoon. And I hope that you can respond in that positive way to the conversation that we have and take on board some of the risks that we see, particularly from a value for money and effectiveness perspective as the Public Accounts Committee. All right? So I'm going to start on the economic circumstances which you find yourselves now. Because when the programme was designed, when you let the contracts, it was 2010, you based it on a much more benign, if not positive, labour market and economic environment. We're now we are in a much more difficult economic environment with rather gloomy OBR forecasts over the next 4 years or so. And I really want to know whether you think that in that climate, the performance requirements that you've set are too high.
Well, we have based our estates, and in particular the prices that we have now contracted, on, as you say, 10 years worth of analysis.
Say that again. I'm really...
So we've based these contract prices, which we've now let, on the analysis of 10 years worth of data up to somewhere around 2010. Right?
Up to 2010?
Well, because we've looked at all of the people who could have been sort of notionally put onto the work programme in 2007-8, and that's a programme that would then run for 2 further years. So one of the first things I did when I looked at this report and saw the way the National Audit was arriving at it was actually to ask the question, given the average that we thought previous programmes had managed to achieve, which is recorded in the report here, actually was there any evidence that as you got towards the end of that 10-year period and people were then having to deal with the recession, that our estimates were sort of plunging off a cliff? The short answer is they were not. So the last quarter's data that we looked at, we've been through every single person on JSA over a year, and then tracked their actual performance through the HMRC's P45 data. We've looked at all of that, and actually the people who actually were referred in January to March 2008, looking at their experience over 2 years, their performance in terms of what they were likely to get at a job at 26 weeks was pretty much within the bounds of variation of all the average of the previous 10
I understand all that. I completely understand how you got to determining your performance requirements when you let the contracts. I do get that. What I'm really asking is a different question, which is that since you've let the contracts in 2010, there's been a change in the economic environment. We've got much more pessimistic OBR forecasts. You are having to, on the OBR, I think on your own figures, I think it was DWP figures, putting 32% more referrals into the work programme. Does that whole environment give you confidence that in this climate you can meet the performance requirements set in your contracts with your prime contractors?
I'm clearly not explaining what I just the first time round. For some of the people that we have tracked on which we have then built the prices, they were experiencing the depth of the recession. And for those people, they were actually achieving a level of performance consistent with the prices
40%.
Consistent with the prices
40%.
The averages that we produced for the JSA claimants, which I think is for 25 plus, I think is 38% on the basis of previous programmes, we were that level of average across the period, we were managing to see something not very far off that, even in the last quarter. Now, the issue is this: the National Audit Office have then come along and done a completely separate calculation, right, which has not had the benefit of going through cohort by cohort, on a programme which ran simply for 18 months, a programme that was just starting, a programme that was rapidly under notice of termination and was in the absolute depth of the recession all the way through. And the question that you need to consider in this consideration of the PAC is, would you rather base a contract that will be making payments for 9 years, because that's how long the work programme will continue, would you rather base it on that very narrow window right in the depth of the recession with all the conditions I've just described? Would you rather base it on something that actually had a long track record of what had actually happened in the real world?
I didn't want to get into an argument with the NAO at this stage. I was asking you, are you confident?
But this is the reason why my answer to your question is yes, I am. Right?
You're confident, right? That's all I wanted to know.
There is a second point to make about this. I mean, I am not determining the performance here. I have let contracts and I have transferred risk to providers, okay? And so, I mean, we can debate for as long as you like whether or not the performance will be. The performance will be what it will be right now. All I can tell you is actually for every single level of performance that actually turns up, well, you will have better value for money and lower provider profits than had I followed the sort of metrics that the NEO were using.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can argue about the transfer of risk, and we'll come to that.
You can't argue about the value for money.
From the point, the value for money, from my perspective, the value for money has to not just be seen in terms of the narrowness of the contract, but if people don't get into work, for all sorts of other reasons, there is an additional cost on the benefit. It may not show on your DWP.
Well, I'm going to disagree with this. You are putting, the taxpayer is about to put in, we've estimated £3 to £5 billion, okay? We have offered you, and the National Grid records it, a return on that investment which is higher than any previous employment programme that you've had, with the possible exception of simply voluntary programmes for loan parents right at the very start of the last government. Therefore, actually, I'm giving you higher value for money. It is the case as
if it works.
No, well, I'm sorry. There are two things going on here, right? Later in the report, it's very, very clear that if it doesn't work, if the providers do nothing better than actually would have happened anyway, they will make no money at all, and their taxpayer will not be paying for this. Okay, so it is clearly the case that actually the question about value for money is critically dependent on what the eventual performance is. But we would be in a much, much worse position, Chair, much worse position, had we actually sort of erred on the side of giving them higher prices, because somehow or other we thought that the NAO's 26% was a good number. I don't think it's a good number. My analysts are considerably better.
I mean, I've got to, at this stage, allow the NAO to come in. Who wants to come in?
Thank you. Interestingly enough, we did an exercise, similarly thought carefully, as we've done all the way through, and we've been in touch regularly about these projections. And what we did was to take our projection, which is one, and we're not saying it's definitely predictive, but we took that. We applied the same base information that Robert used, and we found we came out with the same predicted level of performance that he did. No, I know. Just bear with me. Didn't interrupt. So let me just deal with one thing. So we're not saying there's something weird about our methodology. What we're only talking about is where we are in terms of what is a reasonably predictive state of the economy, and what and you can debate and what relationship that may have to the amount of jobs available and to the results achieved. I think that's right. So
I don't.
And our, as it happens, the level in the sample that we used is more or less the same as that that's been just say by
the over the period of FND, the average, if you take unemployment rate as an indicator of this, the unemployment rate in the average period there was 7.9%. If we've calculated that if we look at the projections from the OBR over the period of the first 5 years of the contract, the average is 7.8. Mm-hmm. The period over most of the New Deal was about 5.1.
So we're not saying that means you definitely won't perform, but it's what all this report is saying is that there are risks to be managed. And so what we say is it's not unreasonable to point out the difference between those sets of numbers, and that's really what we do. And therefore, it's not unreasonable to say, well, if that's true, what tensions to be managed and what risks to be managed does that create? And that's really, we go no further than that.
I'm going to go to Fiona, because in the end, I don't want an argy-bargy between the two of you, really, because it doesn't take us anywhere. So I want us to move on, because there's some key issues.
It's a little bit unfair to not have a discussion about the substantive disagreement in this report. Normally when we come to these committees, we have agreed a report, right? This is the first time in my life I've come to one where actually we've disagreed.
Actually, to be honest, you've done 3 appearances before me, and every time you've disagreed with the report. Every time. Well, and this is your third appearance when you disagree yet again with the report.
I'm quite proud of that. This is the first time the NEO has recorded the disagreement. I normally make it up on the spur of the moment. The reason why I don't think you can gloss over it is because, for better or worse, consistent sort of press coverage has now said, the NEO think we will not make this target, right? It's really important to understand that the NEO have made an estimate here. It is not simply reading off a national statistics press notice that 26% was the observed figure, right? It simply isn't that. There's a large proportion of what the NEO done, which is estimation, because they have not had the time or resources to track through thousands and thousands of HMRC records, as my people have done. So I'm entitled at least to, be cautious about.
Well, let me just say something to you, which I will, if one of the frustrations for all of us, and I'd say this to you as a constituency MP, I've had the biggest frustrations of the work programme of anything I've had to deal with at constituency level. I've met all my 3 prime contractors. They all consistently refuse to give me information, however tough I am. And if you have got data that actually contradicts what they're saying, put it out in the public. Give it to us, and then we can make a proper assessment. The longer you keep it, you keep it behind closed doors, the more suspicious everybody gets.
That is a completely separate point.
No, it isn't. It's a really important point.
I'm sorry, but it is. You're asking about prospective.
No, I'm asking as Barking MP that I should know how many people.
Definite article, I'm sure.
The MP for Barking. Stop doing that to me, you guys. How many people have been referred to the programme? How many people come on ESA? How many people are on JSA? How many people have placed in work? How long they've been in work? And I have been denied all that information. And that would give me a feel as to whether or not the programme was successful.
I know you're asking that. The conversation we were just having...
And I've put PQs in and you've refused to answer them.
I know you're asking that. The conversation we were just having is whether the retrospective look at the NEO is different from my retrospective. It's nothing to do with performance on the work programme, right? I've estimated the prices for a work programme because I had to have the prices before I let the contract. The NEO is estimated FND on the basis of the
Robert,
past.
That's clear. And what we're all saying is when you set those contracts in 2010, you say you set them with the information and knowledge of the 2008 recession. I hear that and understand that. All that's happened here is that the NAO have taken a different view of the impact on the economy of this I won't call it recession, of these changes in economic circumstances.
Which is an unusual thing for an auditor to do, to take a prospective look at the economy.
Well, no, except hang on a minute.
Could you just say that again?
Not fair.
Could you just say that again, Mr. Devereux?
I'm sorry. What I said was it's an unusual thing to do for the auditor to take a prospective view of the economy. Right,
do you want to come back? I've got to let Amy come. Oh, okay, Ed.
I think it's really important that the committee understands that it's intrinsic to almost all audit activities that the auditor forms a view on the prospective analysis and projections undertaken by the audited entity. That is a fundamental feature of all audit. So it is simply not correct to say it is not the auditor's job. And if you look at our work on our financial statement audit and almost all of our value for money reports, they will have an engagement with the projections made by the audited entity.
Okay, let me go to people who do want to ask questions, but let's try and move off the route. Fiona, then Matt, then do you want to come in, Steve?
I want to ask about something completely different.
Good.
Which I think will be perhaps a good thing. I don't think any of the calculations that I have seen look at the issue of job substitution as part of the programme. Because the way that you measure whether someone succeeds is whether the people who are referred to them get put into jobs. Now, in my constituency, one of the things that's happening is a lot of people are being given work experience, unpaid, in retail. And the retailers are then, I think, being directly encouraged to employ people who have had this 1, 2, 3 month interview process. So they have a very confident employment experience, if you see what I mean. It's much better than an interview. And when they're offering jobs, a company like Devereux, which operates in Slough, can say to Primark, if you want more of our free workers, I hope you're going to give us, our people, 20-hour jobs. I'm sure it's not quite as overt as that, Andrew, but I believe that there's a risk of it's happening. And I want to know how in this system, and it's not even in the report, we protect against the risk of job substitution as a result of this programme, because it's not factored into how people are paid.
Okay, well, I'll make one sort of observation on economics, and then I'll ask Alan to pick up the point about just the sort of internship idea. It is part of all the employment programmes that when you find people who have already had a very long spell of employment, we're positively interested in them getting into work. Okay, there is the way in which the employment market works. The biggest single predictor of whether or not you're going to be in work later on is whether you've had a job previously. So actually, it is in society's interests to get people who've been out of work a long time into work.
But you only pay
first,
if they have
right?
20-hour jobs, don't you?
I only pay if they have jobs that last for 26 weeks, if they're JSA people.
And for how many hours in the week? Because that's the critical issue in this.
16.
16. Okay.
16.
Which is the level at which the tax credits kick in as well.
At the moment, but not soon.
Well, it's the level now. So I mean, I've got to work with the system I'm in.
Yes, but you're introducing a system in 2 months' time that those people wouldn't qualify for tax credits.
2 months' time.
Isn't it? I'm very shortly, the tax credit requirement is going to be 24 hours. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. But I mean, the question you're asking about, whether or not, if these people are going into work, they're substituting for other people. I mean, if the reality is that long-term unemployed people are going into work and other people are not, actually, it's a good thing for long-term unemployed people going into work.
Yes, okay.
And that's what the programme is designed to do. That's why governments spend money. This does not make money for the taxpayer. This makes money in the cost-benefit analysis because actually of the wider benefits to society. So it's a positive design as a programme.
Can I just talk about the work experience point for a moment? I think it's an observed big change in the labour market over the last 10 years that more and more companies are using work experience as a tester of whether somebody might be a full-time, an established employee. I mean, those of us with kids know that that's the reality of the labour market. And I think what the providers have, I think, become quite skillful at using, many of them, is to take somebody who is coming onto the programme with a very weak CV in terms of actual experience, and therefore is likely to fail at the first and second hurdles of most recruitment processes for most employers, and find opportunities for them to get some quick blocks of work experience, which, yes, will not be paid and the provider won't get anything for them, but it's going to greatly improve the likelihood of them getting a proper job, if I can put it that way, and one which will lead to a job outcome for which we will pay. And my experience going around providers is that that's really kind of wired into most of their processes with our claimants who come onto their programme.
Matt.
I'm not going to get into the specifics of the ding-dong with the NAO, but I want to ask some questions that follow on from that. The first is, presumably the backward-looking projections refer to results against the forerunners of this proposal. I realise that the work programme it follows a long stream of thinking that's happened over a number of years. So that's presumably those numbers are against the forerunners of the work programme. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hang on a minute.
No,
just to get this clear, that your stats are based on the real numbers in Flexible New Deal.
Yes. In FND, okay. And then,
no, but not yours. Yours don't have regard to the real numbers on Flexible New Deal.
Well, okay.
That's how I understood the report.
I can only answer one question at a time.
I just wanted to get clear that the NAO numbers are based on the FND. And my next question is, on the actual work programme itself, i.e. this proposal that we're looking at today, I'll ask the same question that I asked the providers. how's it going? Do you have any figures? We got broad indications that it's on track in terms of the 2 providers that we spoke to. Apparently there's some constraints about figures being put into the public domain. Do you have any figure? Are there any figures in the public domain? And maybe A4E could say whether they think it's going on track, given that we're, 7 months in?
Okay. I mean, this comes back right to the point that the Chair was making earlier on. This is a 2-year programme, right? And the last person...
5-year programme.
I'm sorry? No, for an individual, it's a 2-year programme. The person who, on the last day of the 2nd year, gets a job, we are prepared to pay right to the end of the following 6 months for the job outcome, and potentially for another 6 months after that for sustainment payments, right? So in practice, it'll be 3 years from June 11 before I know whether or not the average payments for the first cohort in June have actually achieved the 40% for JSA 25 plus that we've talked about, okay? So if you ask me the question, what can I tell you now, the answer is precious little. If somebody would actually get a job outcome that I could talk about today, they would have to have been in work in July. It's a 26-week job outcome, right? So, I mean, we can talk about, whether or not people feel good about this. It's far too early to say, and the reason why, therefore, the national statisticians are not prepared to talk about this until later is they are going to tell you on the 21st of February data that they have about who's been referred to the programme, and they're going to tell you in the autumn what the job outcomes at that point are going to be. Okay. Now that's even at that point, we'll be talking about people whose maximum chance of actually getting to a job outcome will be people up to about, let's say, March of this year. So very, very early in the 3 years I've just described to you. So, I mean, we're not seriously trying to be difficult about this, but if you want to know the answer to the question, how is this programme going, if you set up a programme deliberately giving people 2 years to work because we all believe that 1 year was not long enough, deliberately incentivising sustained payments, it will take a while before we all know. And that's the basis on which the statisticians
Okay, so I've got to follow up to that. I totally understand that. And I think, and I'm sure the committee recognises it. The question on value for money is, if the projections are wrong, who bears the cost?
Right. Well, you have a chart which the NEO constructed on page 28, which talks about what happens at different levels of performance. The one that actually...
Which chart are you pointing us to?
Figure 11, page 28. What that chart shows you is that at the point at which the providers do nothing better than what would have happened anyway, that's the yellow line at the bottom, there is no value for money in this, and they will all make a loss. Right?
There's no value for money for who? For you or for them? Well,
in the event that literally we end up on the
yellow
line,
line,
we'll have paid attachment fees and nothing else.
Yeah.
Attachment fees and just the job outcomes that go with the deadweight cost.
Okay.
As soon as you get into the sort of levels you've seen on previous programmes and above, you're at value for money at something, the first line up after that sort of brownish line, you're getting £1.45 for every pound you've invested. The green line is £1.95 for every pound. The line at the top, the bidders provider, £3.15 for every pound you've invested. And so it clearly matters what level of performance you get in order to answer the question what the value for money is.
Can I just, actually it's interesting on that chart because I don't know how many people have seen it, but Ian Mulhern at SMF did some work on that chart. Have you had the opportunity? And what he says, there are a number of questions on it. The one is that this assumes active targeting, which I don't know what I understand, which seems to me that it's your cherry picking.
Active targeting means different things to different people. Active targeting in a black box system, what we try to say to these providers is, look, if a guy turns up unemployed, hypothetically, with an extraordinarily good CV, I do not want to waste your time in making him go through various bits of process if you can get him into job on day one.
So it's not cherry picking.
Right? So active targeting says when people come through the door, think about what they might need, but there's no flaw to what they might need if actually you can get them into work straight away. Most of the providers actually is the first thing they do with somebody is say, I want your job ready now.
Let me ask you
Hold on, can I just finish my line of questioning? So it's about active targeting is about how you deal with somebody, not about who you get. Because if I'm right, they're randomly allocated, aren't they? which helps to get it. I mean, cherry picking is tricky, but
they're randomly allocated. So you can see from this profit chart that actually the way in which the providers can make profit is by getting above the deadweight costs. Right?
Yeah.
Deadweight are real people. They're going to come through the door, right? Nobody knows who the deadweight is. It's difficult to do. So a smart provider will look at you if it were you and say, actually, I bet I can get him a job quite quickly. I'll spend very little money on to get you into work.
Is that an offer if it all goes wrong?
Well, no, you are employed.
What Professor Finn called creaming.
Sorry?
Isn't that what Professor Finn called creaming?
Well,
he talked about creaming and parking. I think that's what he called.
Yeah, but creaming. Surely creaming can only.
He was positive. I thought I heard him be positive about creaming on the basis that the whole point of this is if you have a system like the previous deals, right? We consistently told providers minimum things they must do.
I don't want to go back to the previous system.
Right. And consequently, what I'm understanding as active targeting is actually the ability of the providers to think rationally about what's the minimum they can do to get something to work, and then spend more money on the people that need more.
So my last question on this thread is that we don't know how it will pan out. We heard from the providers going, all right. The value for money, if there's no improvement, is basically flat for the taxpayer, is your argument from what I take away from figure 11. But if your assumptions about the 40% are wrong, who bears the loss for that?
Well, at the moment, I've let contracts where the only thing for sure that I'm going to part with are attachment fees for people I'm referring.
So, in a sense, right? If you've managed to let contracts on optimistic assumptions, which agreed assumptions between you and the providers, then it's the providers who they'll lose out, won't they?
Correct. I mean, the whole point about payment by results, forgive me for being obvious, is actually having let the contract, we have the argument about what the prices are. The point I was making earlier is we have set prices lower than we would have done if we'd followed the NAO's advice, as a consequence of which, actually, we are going to get better value for money for every level of performance that eventually turns up.
So no matter who's right between you and the NAO,
we win. Taxpayer wins.
Amius wants to come in on that.
Very briefly to say, we didn't give you advice. As a matter of fact, we simply indicated a risk. But I would just to say something. Do you understand that there's a big assumption under what you've just said? I know you know that, Robert. I mean, the big assumption is that you have contractors making little or no money, and you can hold them to the contract, even despite that. Well, maybe it'll work like that. And I understand you've got, and by the way, just take the chance to say you've done a lot of things to fortify your ability to hold them to account. I'm not at all, don't want to get, because we happen to be talking about the projection, I don't want to get in a position which I don't feel of being generally critical about the work programme. We are not. The NAO is not taking that view, nor does our report say. But if you pitch the expected level high and you encourage people in the bidding process to discount on the fee structure they take, and then you hold them to that later on, what you're doing is raising the level of performance they have to have, at which point where they strike break even, which means it's easier for them to start making losses. Only that none of that is necessarily, even it all may be great value for money, but please just, all we're saying to you is, yes, but that does presuppose that in those circumstances you can hold them to the contract and they stay at that contract, and it's not to say we're not predicting they won't, we're simply saying we think it's a realistic risk for you to consider how you're going to manage. And
I agree.
I
agree entirely. Page 17, paragraph 17 of your own report records 4 risks, which the NAO kindly say we're actually on top of. But how much nicer for an accounting officer to be here with you challenging me about whether the providers are going out of business and being challenged on a contract where actually you think I've given them too much money? This is a delight.
I just want to say one other thing, because I was looking at figure 11, which I'm sure you have seen the amendments that SMF put to it, because just taking up what Amius's point there, if you put in the discounts, which average at 5%, immediately the whole profitability of the contract changes. Alan Cave looked to me as if he had seen the SMF stuff.
No, sorry, no, I was...
You hadn't?
No,
so the assumptions behind... I mean, You can't see it from here.
No,
but they've done two figures. One which takes it down to assuming the discounts, which immediately takes you into negative. They then do one which you will dispute, and so we can, but which is even more negative, which is on the assumptions of the NAO's job market.
Sorry, I did the calculations myself. The footnote very clearly says that the NAO has not put price discounts into this report. Right, so I did the same thing that you did. You just dropped these lines. All it does is to reinforce the reality that if these providers do nothing better than would have happened in the economy anyway, they will make a really serious loss. But at the sort of levels which we think they can achieve and they think they can achieve, actually, they will make a profit. But at that level, we will be at very, very good value for money, much better than you've had before.
Steve.
Thank you, Chair. From time to time, we see things that have gone wrong. So could I just start by picking up on paragraph 12 of the report on page 7, which says that it was a significant administrative achievement to deliver this in 12 months rather than 4 years. So just from a balance point of view, I think that is notable and is to be commended. And I'm sure a great deal of work...
Mr Cave and his team for that.
Well, I'm sure a great deal of work went into that. Obviously, there are risks with that, and one of the risks the report picks up on is the risk of fraud. In terms of launching ahead of the IT programme. And I can understand the logic of that on one level, wanting to crack on with it, but there's clear fraud risk. Could you clarify how you're mitigating those risks and how we will get visibility of how effective that mitigation is?
Okay. This is an area where I genuinely think this has been significantly overstated, but let me explain why. The implication of paragraph 310 on fraud and error, I think, is significantly overstated. And let me explain why, because actually, my own internal auditors have supported me in this view. Okay, in respect to the IT, slightly contrary to what you might have imagined when you read it, we made sure that from day one we had the IT capacity to make referrals to the work programme and for them to claim an attachment fee, which is the only thing on day one I needed to do. As I've described to you earlier, even if the first person through the door, JSA over 25, got a job outcome, they would not be getting a job outcome until the 31st of December. Now, it is the case, as this report records, that actually the all-singing, all-dancing IT that enables me to check everything line by line will be there in March 12th. Okay? Now, it is not because somehow or other we sort of decided to take a long time over it. It's precisely because actually the policy question about exactly what would the payment by results mechanism look like was still very much live and debated as we ran into the spending review, right? And so what we've then done is to say to ourselves, let's make sure that we have enough IT to get this thing started in June 11. Let us then make sure we have something that can automatically check every single claimant back to the ordinary records by March 12th, right? In the meantime, some people...
Will it happen in March?
Sorry?
Will it happen in March?
Yes, it would. In the meantime, some people will get job outcomes and we will have paid them, okay? The only basis on which there's going to be any error or fraud is if actually when I then come to check all of these from March onwards, it turns out that actually there's an error. And, by the way, the provider's gone out of business and I can't chase off them, they have no assets and I owe them no money.
That was one of my questions,
this is so low a probability that my own internal auditors did not regard it as being worth investing more money in doing any further checks of what is essentially a transitional problem where we've got very long contracts that actually we're paying.
Okay. Just want to come on to it because I'm conscious Mr Dutton has largely not had any questions so far.
Fine by me. That side.
And
bring it on.
I was just struck by paragraph 14, page 8, which talks about the significant cost in terminating existing welfare to work contracts. I imagine I'd be interested as to how much you were paid, your firm was paid in terms of termination, given that you're contracting with government on this contract, but also how many other contracts you have in terms of your relationship with government.
If I start with the F&D settlement, so in our contracts and all providers' contracts, there was a provision for settlement. And my contract deems, and actually the confidentiality agreement that I signed with DWP, unfortunately, doesn't allow me to tell you what my settlement was. Right. So I'd refer that question to DWP if you want further information.
Right.
Can you tell us?
Did anyone
Robert?
try and talk to you about places like Berkshire, where you were the previous provider, the current provider, about negotiating whether there can be a continuation through? Because you're not the only provider which is continuing to provide, admittedly a different programme, but in the same place you used to.
We had very active conversations with the DWP about transitional arrangements, and clearly the best thing for customers, and certainly the best thing would have been for us as a provider, would be to have had a transition where we already provided services. I think we need to recognise this was a competition under EU procurement rules, and that means that the DWP had to mark its review of those bids and then determine who was best to deliver those services. Whether that was A3 or other providers in terms of being able to continue the service was really not the outcome that necessarily could have been controlled by the DWP.
Going back to the other part of my question, how many other contracts do you have with government, and what's the total value cumulatively of all those contracts?
We have other contracts with government and other government agencies. So we deliver skills funding agency support for apprenticeships. We also, for example, run the money advice service. So we have a series of contracts, and our total revenue in the UK, because we're also an international business working in 7 countries, of the £230 million we turned over last year, would be approximately around about 160 to 180 million in the UK.
You're going
out of that 160 to 180, how much was public sector contracts?
All of that would be public sector contracts.
So you're a public sector contract business?
Yes, we are.
Do you think you should be subject to FOI?
I think where it's appropriate, yes, we do, and we have received many freedom of information questions that are effectively taken through to us by the department.
So why can't you tell us how much you got for the termination of the contract?
The reason I can't tell you what I got is because I have a confidentiality agreement which I've signed with the department, and the department have effectively asked us to keep that information.
Robert, can you tell us?
This is contract let by the previous government. It does contain that clause, and actually, because I would say at the moment also because the negotiations are not complete with all the ex-FND providers.
I wasn't asking about them all. I was asking about Mr. Dutton's.
Well, the same point applies really. Whilst the negotiations are ongoing, it doesn't help us.
Was the
get value for money
confidentiality clause prohibiting this in the settlement contract that you're currently negotiating? Because if it's currently negotiating, I can't understand how it's been signed and therefore is legally binding. Or was the confidentiality clause in the original contract that was entered?
In the original contract.
And that said, if it is terminated, a confidentiality clause will be binding.
That's right.
Okay, well, this goes to the heart, really, of what I can't understand. The very first thing you're taught as a lawyer when looking at a contract is the most important thing is the termination clause. Because if you can walk away from a contract, you can renegotiate. It's absolutely the most basic, elementary thing that you learn. And time again, we had the same issue with the Department of Transport on the M25, and we've had it on a number of hearings. The basic failure within Whitehall to have adequate termination clauses because things change, governments change, desire to change. And it's perhaps an issue that the Treasury officer needs to take away. But I do find it quite remarkable if we have a business that is turning over around £180 million from our constituents, which has a multiple number of contracts with the taxpayer, that is bidding for new work with the taxpayer in the same field, and yet we're paying so far 63 million with more to come in order to pay for work that's not been done on a contract which was front-loaded in the first place.
Okay,
I mean,
can
it
I
just
correct?
seems a remarkable waste of money.
So I may have given the misapprehension earlier on, and I'd like to perhaps give a bit more detail as well, if that would help. So the termination clause itself is completely transparent and visible. You can look up on our website and see every clause in the contracts. What is not transparent is the fine detail of the settlement which we make when we enact that clause. Now, if it helps, I can give an indication of the sorts of things which have been allowed and not allowed in these discussions, and we're happy to elaborate on that later if that would help.
But do it now.
I'm not asking whether the pros of the clause, the boilerplate nature of the clause is transparent. What I'm asking is why it was so poorly drafted. It's bound your hands in a way where, if you're in the private sector, if you had multiple contracts with a firm, you had a relationship with a firm, you would use that negotiating clout to say, okay, we're not continuing with this piece of work, but we've got another piece of work, and we've got a whole other things we're doing with you. and we want to negotiate a deal.
Okay, so there are two things on that. Firstly, we have separate processes which under EU law we can't join together. One is for procurement of fresh programmes. When we have to run those as open competitive processes which don't allow us to do side deals with individual competitors on the basis of previous relationships they may have had with us. So that's just a constraint we have to operate on. Sure. But secondly, and if I could just complete what I was saying earlier, Chair, I mean, we have taken a very strict interpretation in these negotiations with the exiting FND providers about what is allowable, and it is only those things which were breakage costs that they could not justifiably be expected to bear, given that they had invested, for example, in office leases, or they had to make staff redundancy costs and had to bear a cost as a result of the government breaking the contract or terminating the contract early. So we have not allowed anything which is a predictive profit stream or anything which was to do with future business.
So if they carry on,
very strict on that.
If they carry on needing offices, if they carry on needing an office, which if they continue to have a contract, they probably will do, then you were able to knock that off, were you?
Yes. So I mean, and bear in mind, I think the contract, the NAO report makes the point about the amount of movement around. There aren't that many FND providers who are servicing in the same areas, and the contract boundaries are very different. So there is a very small amount of continuity, and we're talking typically about leases on buildings which a provider had to exit and staff they had to make redundant because they were closing down in the southwest and starting in the northeast, or leaving the industry, or leaving the business completely.
No doubt they let the lease to the new contractor.
When will we be able to know who got paid for what?
We would pick that up. That's not something which we allow.
And could I just clarify with Mr.
When will we be able to know who got paid for what? I understand that we can't at the moment because you're still negotiating with other people. I want to know when we're able to know.
I guess these will come through. I don't know. Is the answer? We can come back to you on that.
Coming back to you.
Yeah.
We come back to the committee and just note that we want to know, because that's the value for money, one of the value for money aspects of the 63 million. Steve, have you finished?
Just one very quick. You mentioned, Mr. Dutton, 180 million. Was it turnover?
Yes.
And your profits on that?
Around about 4% margin.
4%.
As a group, as an international group.
Oh, no, on the 180 million. I presume you report.
In terms of operating profit, I could get back to you, but I couldn't tell you the exact operating profit on the business.
As a rough
figure. Business, our net operating profit is 4.5% over the past 4 years.
Okay, perhaps we can have a note.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about 310, Mr. Devereux, which you were talking about earlier? You mentioned your internal auditors not being worried about this particular risk of contractors or subcontractors going bankrupt. That was exactly one of the concerns I had. In paragraph 310, it basically explains how, until the computer system is fully up and running, the department will complete limited checks and it won't reconcile them to the prime contractor's records. But then subsequently, there will be some sort of clawback process, I suppose. Can you explain how that clawback process will work? And how are you guarding against the possibility of people going bankrupt? Because it has been known for people to go into government schemes, take the money, and then set up new entities. It happened with the individual learning account.
Yes. Oh, okay. I mean, I do know this has happened, but
well, I was just referring back to the one of the committee's recommendations after the Pathways report, in which you asked us to look very closely at this whole area of checks and controls on payments. And you asked us to make sure we had 3 things, which were systematic checks against benefit records, contact with individuals and their employers, and where errors are found, the rest of the provider claim would be investigated and deductions included. Now, those are exactly the 3 things which we have built the controls for work programme on, those very 3 things. And every claim, including the ones which are made in this interim period, will run through those 3 checks 100%. So there is no claim...
You mean afterwards?
Afterwards.
Ex-post.
And in the
because that's precisely, I mean, it's exactly what it says in paragraph 3.7. It's precisely what it says it can't do. However, it could not complete an automatic check against other records that somebody was in work, had off benefits, and could not make a payment for a successful job or sustainment outcome. Nor could it generate complete management information.
Not in the interim period
yes,
before March 12.
Yeah.
So every single payment that has been made by March 12 will be put through the process which Alan's just described. And
the department also estimates that 10% of these payments could fail the check to prove that employment has started. So of the 60 million, you're saying that you expect that 6 million may be, as it were, exposed. Is that right?
Well, let's be clear where that figure has come from. So we've looked back at our previous programmes where people have sort of submitted claims and seen the failure rate of them. Our observation is that many of these failures are actually because, for example, people gave us the wrong telephone number to ring the employer with, and so when we fail that one, they simply resubmit it with the right telephone number, we pay with it later. So the gross amount of failure, which is largely to do with administrative cock-up, is not the same as actually the risk that the taxpayer is facing. Have I explained that?
Right, yes. Now, you've said this is an interim problem and that once the IT system is fully embedded, by the end of March 2012, you should be able to solve this problem.
No, but the end of next month.
The end of next month, yes, March 2012. Yeah. I'm interested in what happens should there be any slippage. How much does the 10 million, the 60 million pounds rise for each month's delay if it went on a month beyond March to the end of April, or 2 months beyond to the end of May, or 3 months beyond to the end of June? Because it's not unknown for IT systems to slip, and indeed it says in paragraph 312 that the department's budget for introducing the management information system was 4.6 million. However, it underestimated the complexity of the project, and the budget now stands at 8.6 million. Now, this is obviously
85%.
This is obviously small there compared with many other government IT projects, but it's still a lot of money, and it's nearly doubled. So, what are the implications of the slippage? How much extra would it cost for each month's delay?
Well, firstly, there will not be a delay. I'm the SRO for that project. It is on time. It is going to start in March. So the rest of what I'm about to say is hypothetical. The payment curve does, the implication behind your question is right, because, of course, from December and January onwards, we are now picking up the job outcomes for those who have been in work for 6 months. So as we go past March, the curve is really quite steep.
It gets steeper.
Yeah, it does. Because that's when which is why we judged March as being the time when we still had a manageable number of people to put through a manual process up until March, and indeed allowed for a couple of months contingency in case something should have gone wrong. It's not going to go wrong. It will be there in March.
But what's the answer to my question?
20 million.
20 million?
Per month.
20 million per month extra?
Job outcomes.
So it goes from 60 to 80 to 100 to 120, is that what you're saying?
And so what we're saying is, in the amount of job outcomes that are going through, a small number, very small, given the conversation I had earlier about the delay in this, will have occurred by the time we get to March. That's the 16th.
So as long as there isn't a further delay and it's delivered on time, that's fine. It's just that we've seen backlogs in a lot of different areas, whether it's Rural Payments Agency or CSA, and they have their own way of running out of control.
I'd be very happy to write the committee on the 1st of April, confirming that the...
I think you better do it in the afternoon if you're doing it on the 1st of April. But
Austin, Meg, Jackie is what I've got. Just to tell you.
3 million, which was paid to 12 of the 14 contractors, with 2 to be decided in spring, was paid to the same contractors to do a similar job. How many of them stayed doing that job in the same area?
I think it's covered in...
It says that in section part
9 or something.
There's paragraph 2.4. It says 8 of the 40 contracts were awarded to prime contractors with experience of delivering over in precisely the same area.
So it would be fair to see it as a bum to these companies to stay on and do a tougher contract?
No. For the reasons that Alan's just described, we're simply precluded from making decisions about the new contractor on the basis of some past things. I mean, all we've done is we've taken contracts, which are perfectly straightforward contracts, and made the minimum possible payment consistent with the fact that we had chosen to not continue with the contract. there is a rule of law. They had a contract. That's what we've done. We've not in any way sought to reward people for sort of profits foregone when they've moved into a new world.
Can I just ask you a question about that? Because it seems rather surprising to me that in a managing contract process, you did not have regard to the past performance of contractors. Why not?
We didn't have regard to the past. I mean,
it's somewhere in the report.
One of the things we have deliberately tried to do here is not just to produce a completely new way of contracting that transfers risk to the providers and gets a higher level of performance. We're also deliberately trying to set these contracts up on a basis that actually we bring in new entrants and actually put a little bit more.
I understand that, but if, let me be completely specific.
So new entrants can't have a past performance, so I can't use it as
Of course they can't, but A4E, for example, I'm going to come back to A4E, but A4E we had up last when we looked at pathways to work, and their performance on that was frankly abysmal. And I can't remember the other one. It was sort of 8%. Was it 8%? 9% into work. Now, if any sensible person, if you were letting a contract in your home for anything, or if you were a private business, you would look at past performance before you decide whether or not to it would be a factor. Now, you couldn't. Doesn't that mean that everybody would necessarily meet that criteria? You might not be able to look at the past performance of everybody.
So let's be very pleased they can't make money at that sort of level of performance then.
Pardon?
Let's be very pleased that they can't make money.
Well, we're not very pleased actually. I'm getting rather fed up with this because at the end of the day, the purpose of this programme is to support unemployed people back to work.
Yes.
If they don't perform, more people stay on the dole. That's not a good outcome. It may not, it may not cost the taxpayers much money, but it's not a good outcome, and I don't think we should be saying that.
I thought we started this on the basis that we were pleased the work programme was in place, and we were inquiring as to the value for money and managing of it.
You're trying to take it off the point. All I would ask you is why didn't you look at past performance of contractors in the evaluation of your bids?
How would I do that for a new entrant?
Well, I obviously can't for a new entrant,
but
you could have done.
How can I do it fairly?
Because there have been. I mean, everyone talks this brand new programme. I have to say to you, the Flexible New Deal had also a performance-related pay element into it, not to the same extent. So this is an evolution of past trends. We have a lot of data. There's a lot of data in DWP around that.
I mean, we are still required to let contract through a fair and transparent process where there are clear criteria. If I can't use a criteria for some new entrants,
are you seriously saying that you could not take into account the fact that A4E had dreadful performance in the immediate predecessor programme, or one of the immediate predecessor programmes?
Well, how would I do it fairly? How would I do it fairly under procurement rules?
I'm not asking you to ask me a question. I'm asking you a question to which I'd like a yes or no. And I think the answer is
no.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. Are you seriously saying that despite the dreadful performance of A4E, which we saw over the Pathways to Work programme, who were delivering, I seem to remember the figures were 9% when they were expected to deliver 30%. You're seriously saying that is not something, despite that really poor track record, you're seriously saying that is not something you can take into account?
I am saying that.
That's right. And just to remind the committee that actually you did conclude last time that all of the Pathways to Work providers were pretty much equally falling behind in performance. So I don't think it would have been a differentiator, actually.
To be fair, though, we're comparing apples with oranges there, aren't we? I mean, ultimately, if a provider isn't delivering, you do have measures under the contract where you can actually transfer to the provider. So we will get to the outcome we want.
We haven't talked about that part of the contract, but I think it's another rather good thing they put in. So we've been talking about the competition for the market. This is the competition we've been doing now. Precisely because we've ensured that 2 or 3 providers are in every single region. Yeah. We also have instituted competition within the market. So after year 3, I believe, if there's daylights in the performance between these two providers, we will start shipping more people to the more successful person.
Which is a very good thing. Can I just ask, is it EU rules that are telling you can't take EU rules that prevent you from taking past performance into... I'm astounded. Can you just write us a note on that?
Absolutely.
Will you?
Can I?
Yeah, go on.
I didn't have a chance to attack the EU, but I just wanted to move on. I'm slightly grateful for that information, but aren't you going to have to... I mean, this programme was obviously imposed in haste. You didn't have a trial pilot or anything, and you didn't do a cost-benefit case before it was conceived. Aren't you going to have to go to the Treasury for more money. I see that 136, paragraph 136 says that the cost of the programme cannot be met by its current settlement with Treasury with a 16% increase in referrals, and yet you were thinking of 2.4 million going on the programme at the start. Now we've got 3.27 million going out onto the programme. Aren't you going to be out of money?
No. And the reason for that is because the settlement that we did with the Treasury was based on a margin above the numbers at the time we expected to put onto the work programme. Right? And we're now at the position where actually our latest forecast, which exactly as you say is higher, is coincident with the budget that we have already secured.
Even the 32%?
Sorry?
32% increase in inflow?
It's not... Sorry.
I think it's a DWP figure. DWP have put out figures on the increased number of people going into the work programme, and it's 32%.
The National Audit Office, in fact...
No, it's your own figures.
Okay.
Which I saw before I came here. I mean, I haven't got the
all I can tell you is I asked...
You must know what figures you put out.
I asked exactly the same question that Mr Mitchell did, and how can it be that this calculation has been done? And the answer is this calculation is the point at which, given that we had more cash in our settlement than was consistent with the particular
does Alan Cave know the answer to it? Because literally the DWP...
I think it's about 20%.
20%.
So the latest... So we adjusted the projections we had of volumes going onto the programme in the light of the last OBR update, and that led to the figures which were published in December. Those are about 20% higher.
32%.
20% higher over the course of the programme.
And the settlement we're talking about...
The National Audit Office's calculations of the success rate are based on figures more recently than the contract figures were based on. The unemployment is higher, the economy is not doing as well. Now, this creates the possibility that some of the contractors, and I'm not sure whether it's the main contractors or the subcontractors, are not going to be able to fulfil their targets. Ministers told us that this is a good system, and I agree with them, because they'll be penalised. If they don't reach the target, they don't get paid. Now, in that situation, do you anticipate that contractors or subcontractors will be allowed to go bust? As ministers are telling us, schools can go bust and hospitals can go bust if they don't manage themselves financially in a competent fashion. Do you anticipate that you'll have to bung them some more, or will they be able to cut standards? What's going to happen?
It's integral to a payment by results contract that if the results don't turn up, you don't get paid. And ministers have already acknowledged that could indeed result in a provider going to the wall. Ministers have made perfectly clear we have arrangements in place to secure both immediate response from the contractor in the same area and to get another contractor off the framework provider in order to continue with the service provision. So we are not sitting here thinking that this programme stands or falls by whether every single provider stays in business exactly as it is at the moment.
How does the pricing work in those circumstances? How does the pricing work in those circumstances? If you have to call off another contractor off the framework because somebody's gone to the wall, is it just at the same prices as were being paid to the previous contractor?
No, we'd run a quick mini competition between all the providers in that regional lot of the framework for that particular contract.
Right, and would you expect that if a contractor, or shall we say several contractors, have gone to the wall in a particular area, that would affect the prices at which people would bid?
It would depend on what the other provider in the same region had done. Yeah. So, I mean, we've told you that we've deliberately constructed competition inside the market. So if actually we have a perfectly good provider and somebody simply is not that good and goes busts, then my hunch is that people won't pitch a price any higher than the other guy, because otherwise, that will be a good benchmark. So that's what I think the answer will be.
But rather, at the end of the day, it's a hunch, isn't it? It depends on, as you say, your word. It's a hunch. It depends on economic conditions. It seems quite likely that if there's a lot of failure in a particular region of the country, and the report does refer to the fact that in certain
regions are tougher than others.
This is paragraph 120. Providers in areas of high unemployment will find it more difficult to achieve nationally set targets. If you had a concentration of failure in a particular area, the likely response from the market would be to demand a higher price to take part. I mean, would you agree with that?
If we have several people in the same area in that position, I agree that the price of economics, that must be what would follow. I mean, this business about sort of regional disparities, typically every single one of these regions has got more variation in unemployment inside it than there is between the regions. So everybody is having to manage areas which have got hotspots and very difficult labour markets, and that's the nature of welfare to work.
Yeah, because we're really talking about the 600,000 people that Sir Lee Lewis used to talk about who've been workless for a very long period of time in many cases, aren't we? Is that right?
Well, that's not true of everybody. I mean, the JSA, even the people who are flowing on to 12 months at JSA, 90% of them flow off benefit before they get to 12 months. I mean, there's quite a big churn in JSA, even for people who won't get to 12 months. It is also the case, correctly, that there are other people who have not been in work for a long period, but I mean, I wouldn't want to make sort of synonymous with the work programme.
You're going to have to make some concessions to companies that are in difficulty. I mean, one of the earlier subcontractors referred to the pleasure of having the Olympic site in Westfield. Now, for some reason, which I don't understand, neither the Olympic site nor Westfield came to Grimsby. And it's going to be much tougher there to get people...
They heard all about the local MP.
These aberrations happen all the time.
I've faced it through my life.
I've not been to Westfield either, so, you know.
To get people into work there, the contractor is therefore going to be facing more difficulties. What are you going to allowance are you going to make for the difficulty of the area? Whether you decide to change the terms, to allow them to run it in a less expensive fashion, lower the standards, whatever.
I mean, well, I'm afraid I'm going to go back slightly to the answer I gave you. I mean, Grimsby is in the same geographical region as Leeds.
As well?
As Leeds.
So it's better.
Sorry?
Sorry.
Stop it.
I've been to both. They're both very nice. The point is that the contractor who's covering Grimsby is having to manage Grimsby and Leeds together. So whichever one you think is having difficulty, is having to manage both of those. We are not in the business. We are not in the business of making a soft touch with these contracts. We've let the contracts. We've transferred risk. Okay. We understand, and I perfectly agree with the National Audit Office recommendations about the things we ought to keep an eye on, and we're keeping an eye on them. But actually, we're not sitting here thinking, any minute now, we're about to write another cheque.
But you've let the contract on another set of conditions. Things have got worse since you let the contracts.
Well, I have transferred the risk to that. I've transferred the risk to that to the providers.
So, Mr. Dutton, you're the sucker. It transferred the risk to you. The name of the game has changed. The conditions have changed. There's more unemployment. It's more difficult to get people jobs. What do you do if you can't reach your targets in that situation?
Work harder.
We have to work very hard. And from our perspective, we looked at the contract. We looked at the volumes that were going to come through it, how quickly we thought we could place people into work, what percentage of job entry we would make. And I think it's really important to say that the economic conditions are a consideration when we bid. Of course they are. If you look at national statistics at the moment, there are 436,000 jobs publicly available. You can at least double that in terms of vacancies that are available in the UK, so 900,000 to 1 million vacancies. The thing that's most important for us as a provider is how we work with an individual and how we tailor support around them. And the biggest effect we can have is supporting people to gain new skills, think through how they're going to potentially move into a new industry, match that individual to the employer, and very importantly, make sure that we have really strong relationships with employers so that we have dedicated vacancies that are specific for those people who we're targeting from long-term unemployment.
Why weren't you doing this before?
We weren't doing that before.
No, you weren't. We've already addressed the fact that your previous programme failed. You were on, was it 9% against a target of 30%?
So, Madam Chairman, our actual performance on Pathways to Work at the end of the contract was 24.2% of people into work, and we sustained 52.7% of those people in work for 6 months. The point at which the committee looked at Pathways to Work was in the middle of that programme. If you look at the success of it by the end, it was a very different picture in terms
Your
of...
Your target was 30 what?
Our target at the time was 34.2%.
So you missed your target, and is not the danger here and I have great sympathy with the department, it's transferring risk, and on behalf of the taxpayer, quite rightly. My concern is that charities, potentially that are less commercially savvy than your private company that doesn't put annual accounts, I mean, I presume you file your finances with Companies House, but
we do.
You don't put your annual accounts. It's a privately owned company. It's not exactly transparent around its finances, will be squeezing the subcontractors in the form of charities. And so to what extent is there a risk that charities doing a lot of good work on the ground have entered into perhaps less commercially savvy contracts with the providers, and when push comes to shove, it's the subcontractors that are going to get squeezed, as opposed to you as the main provider?
I disagree with the premise that we as prime providers, as A3 or any others in the market, are going to put the squeeze on our subcontractors. We, as an organisation, have contracted with one of the lowest management fees of 12.5% in terms of working with our providers. What we do is we pass down payments as and when we receive them from the DWP, and this is a performance-based contract, and we expect all of the providers in our network to perform. And therefore their performance is critical to ours as a prime contractor, but also to theirs in terms of whether they remain in our supply chain. We worked very hard, both in pre-contracting and through contracting with each of our providers, particularly those in the third sector, to capacity build them. We put them in touch with the Foundation for Social Improvement, who capacity build charities, so that they can absolutely think through the contract that they were signing. All I can do is ask that the boards of those charities, when signing up to the contracts that we've put in front of them, and we gave them many different options in terms of how they could contract with us, the majority chose to just take reflective terms and conditions of those that we took with the DWP. So we did not vary those contracts in terms of how we're paid or the terms and conditions for the DWP. We take the significant risk as a provider, as A4E. We deliver 49%, providers for us deliver 49% of our volume that comes through. 51% is delivered by DWP, by A3. We are taking the risk of working capital for our provision, and the providers that we have in our network are taking the working capital risk for their provision.
Mr Dutton, I've got to interrupt you there because you happen to be, as you know, a prime provider in Barking and Dagenham.
Indeed.
And as you know, I've done 2 meetings now with you in the constituency. And the second meeting was with a subcontractor, which is a charity called
Yes.
Lifeline, which you'll know. At that meeting, you told Lifeline that you got £350, or your representatives told Lifeline that you got £350 as an attachment fee. Actually, you get £400. You didn't, so there was a mistake in what you told them. You then give Lifeline £300, only £300, and I cannot for the life of me, sorry, I shouldn't use it, cannot for the life of me see any value that you add at all for that £100 you take off as sheer profit of each person that is referred to Lifeline, who I've known for years and who are a good local charitable employment provider.
If there was misinformation at that meeting, then I apologise.
And then why do you take £100?
I'm very
why
clear.
Do you 25%?
We take 12.5%.
You take 25%. It was clear in that meeting. Lifeline get £300 of attachment fee for everybody you refer to them.
Every single one of the providers in our network, we take a 12.5% management fee on behalf of our providers.
They get £300, Mr Dutton.
We get £400, and our subcontractors get £350.
No.
If there was misinformation...
They were in there. I did this meeting. We had several witnesses there. The £350 and £300. Let me go on. Because perhaps you can write to me, because I can assure you I've got a note of the meeting. They were told £350, which is why I was surprised when I read the report. It's actually £400. They get £300. Even if it was £50, I can't for the life of me understand what you give them for the £50. Nothing. The only thing that you could say in a meeting of about an hour that you gave them was that there's a contract with London Transport that ensures that London Transport vacancies are referred down the line across London to all, which is a great thing to have, but it doesn't sound to me value for money.
We, as a prime provider, contract with our subcontractors and we take a management fee. In return for that management fee, we do several things. We, very importantly, in the work that we do, work with large employers and regional employers and small medium enterprise to effectively get vacancies that are dedicated to the
Mr. Dutton,
providers.
just with the greatest of respect, Lifeline have worked with the Tesco's, the Asda's, all those forever and ever. The only thing you could add value was the London Transport, and Lifeline have a far better knowledge and relationship with all the SME and local providers. You don't even know who they are. When I had the first meeting with them, with you, you hadn't a clue about my local economy. Let me go on, because the other thing was what emerged at this meeting was that for every advisor, because the money is so tight, every advisor that Lifeline has, they have 120 clients. Now, assume they work a 40-hour week. I don't know. Assume they work a 40-hour week. Even if they used every minute of that for direct contact with the individual, that would give them 20 minutes, not to follow it through or anything like that. How on earth can you provide a quality service if actually in the finances available, a very good provider locally has to have 120 clients for each advisor to make the finances stack up?
I can't speak for how Lifeline undertook their modelling in terms of how they decided the number of people that they were going to have and then support the number of customers that they have through their door. What I do know is that in A4E, our average...
Can you just say to me, do you think that's a quality service for people who've been out of work for a minimum of 9 months?
I think the service that Lifeline provides...
Can it be a quality service with 120 clients for each advisor?
It absolutely depends on the mix of the customers that that individual advisor is working with, what services that individual organisation is providing, and therefore I believe that Lifeline provide a very high quality service, and I think they would agree.
I know they're a good organisation, they're a charitable organisation, they are really good. I just challenge you that there is no way with the sort of cohort, even if they're all JSA, don't let's even touch the ESA, JSA who've been out of work 9 months or a year, that 120 to 1 will give you any, I mean, it'll have to be a total online service, bar a few. Can I just ask you, in that context, your top management last year took 4.7 million. Is that correct?
The total remuneration of the board? Sorry, I don't know where you're quoting your figures from.
I think it's from your report and accounts. And the dividends, it's a private company, isn't it?
We are a private company.
So you pay 11 million dividends, so they don't pay PAYE and they only pay corporation tax.
I couldn't find the numbers.
Pardon?
I couldn't find the numbers, so...
Well, I got this, my researcher got this from somewhere.
Are these for this year? Because would they be lodged at companies' house?
They were, anything that's been quoted will be for the previous years.
Yeah, that's my point. So from a transparency point of view, your profits for this year are not public yet?
Profits for this year, no, are not public.
And the remuneration, so it'll be previous years we're dealing with.
Do you think these are 11, 12? I think these...
No, it'll be 10,
Can't be 11, 12.
Sorry, 10, 11.
11, 12 hasn't finished yet.
Yeah.
When is your financial year end, Mr. Dutton?
Financial year end is March. Well, April.
31st of March.
31st of March, yeah.
But it just seems to me that in a context of meanness to my very good provider in Barking and Dagenham, your top management are taking off 11 million in dividends, which is a tax efficient way of trying to get more money into the pockets of the people who own the company, and 4.7 million in management. That's the figures I've got.
The dividends that are paid to shareholders of our company...
It's a private company.
It is a private company.
So presumably the executive are the shareholders.
We have a small group of shareholders, and the dividends that we pay to those shareholders reflect the personal risk that they have of having owned a business over 21 years. At times in their life they have effectively put their own house and mortgages on the line, and when businesses perform well, it's appropriate that shareholders do.
No one's disputing that, because very much support people investing in companies and doing well. No issue. We're just trying to get a hand. What's the highest concentration owned by one individual?
The highest concentration owned by one individual is, and I would need to come back to you on the exact figures, is 87% or 87.5%.
So in the 180 million that the taxpayer is paying, 87% of the profits, of which you're going to provide clarification, 87% of that profit from the taxpayer on the 180 million, which is funding the advice. And the department's quite right to shift the risk. I'm just trying to understand whether we're getting value for money from your organisation. 87% of that profit's going to one individual. But it's not in the public domain what that equates to in terms of hard cash.
In terms of the dividends that are paid at any moment in time, some years dividends are paid, some years dividends are not paid. In that particular year, a significant dividend was paid.
Okay, can I just ask something? No, if I may come back to the fact you've got this contract by competition.
We did get
so
this
these are interesting, but they don't necessarily reflect on the value for money of the contract. The interesting facts.
Well, I just wanted to ask one final question. A4E designed the contracts, or helped the department design it. It's really to Mr. Devereux, Alan Cave. Is that right? My understanding is that in the work that was undertaken to determine how you were going to contract, you took advice from A4E. They were paid £300,000.
I don't think that's an accurate representation. We did our best through a very busy period to consult with the whole marketplace, particularly all those on the framework, at key times to get their view about what might work best and where the risk profile was in order to manage our risk, but there was no
I gather they were paid £300,000 for that work.
No, that's not.
That's not true.
No. Not on
Do you
the
think?
programme. No.
Pardon?
No, there was no.
That's
there was no external.
True.
No.
That's definitely not true.
No provider was paid anything to help design the work programme.
But is it appropriate that those that helped design the contract then went on to compete and win contracts? Is that appropriate?
But they didn't.
Pardon?
I just said they didn't.
So A4E didn't help you design the contract?
No.
Go on.
No,
help me.
So I think there's shifts in the line here. I think what Alan just said is that very reasonably we went and talked to the markets before we put the contract out, so that means we'll get the contract straight. He said quite definitely we did not pay anybody for that.
Okay.
But it is pretty typical, I think, to be talking to a market to make sure that the market actually understands what the ITT is going to look like.
Meg.
Can I just ask, Mr. Dutton, how many clients per advisor do you have or is it different for different contracts in different areas?
It's different for different contracts in different areas, but the average, for example, where we have job seeker allowance customers is 1 to 80.
So 1 to 80?
1 to 80, 80.
80, okay. And in terms, just to be absolutely clear about how that works, in terms, you get the money for accepting someone, first of all, that's the upfront money, the taxpayers' money.
Yes.
Then when someone's placed in a job, you get money, is it at that point or when they've been in the job for how long? How long do they have to be in the job for?
They have to have been in a job depending on which type of benefit they're on for either 3 months or 6 months.
Okay, so the minimum is 3
The minimum is 3.
Okay, so if someone's put in a job and they only last for a month, there is no financial benefit to you
None at all.
Of that, except for someone might get experience, which...
Of course, which is extremely valuable for the person going through the programme.
And in the work that you're doing, do you do any measurement of the social capital, the benefits to go? I mean, do you do qualitative work? Because I know there's going to be an evaluation that the department will do. But are you doing your own qualitative as well as quantitative work on the outcomes?
We are doing some qualitative work in terms of understanding that we will place a significant number of people into work over the life of this programme. There will be some people who do not, through that programme, find their way into long-term sustainable employment. That does not mean that those individuals have not actually improved their lives through that period of their work with us over a 2-year period. And we will be looking at how much further towards work or their integration into society and into community that we've helped provide, because we will enable people to work within charities, to work within businesses where they've gained experience. So we will be looking at how the programme has worked qualitatively for us as well as quantitatively in terms of output.
And given that the harder to reach people have dealt with organisations like Lifeline, which was also active in my constituency, do you do an analysis of them qualitatively as well and the work that they're doing? And do you have break clauses in the subcontract that you've got with them if you feel they're not performing, whether it be on the financial side or on the actual output?
We're certainly not looking at the qualitative measures within our subcontractors. If they, for example, are charities, they may themselves be looking at those qualitative measures. Yes, we do look at the quantitative measures in terms of their performance. And as the DWP has minimum performance standards with us, we have set the exact same minimum performance standards with our subcontractors. And we do have break clauses, as the DWP does with A4E within our contracts, yes.
So you have a break, okay, you have breaks. In terms of, if I just Yeah, in terms of, well, two things I want to ask Mr. Devereux of you, maybe Mr. Cave as well. We can't get our figures locally as MPs about number of referrals and so on. Now, I understand you've actually put a good argument about what the challenges of assessing partway through a programme, what the outcomes are, but it is very helpful to us knowing if we've got this number of people who are unemployed in our area. I can look at the trends of how long people have been unemployed. I've got particular issues in my area, for instance, with young people, with men over 50. I have no idea how many of them are in the work programme. I have got no way of assessing that. Why can't that information be made public? It's taxpayers' money. It's a programme to get people into work. We are elected members of Parliament. This committee is the Public Accounts Committee, yet we have no data that we can get any assessment of what's actually working, even in our own areas. Why is that? I'll go back to that again.
Okay, so I tried to explain earlier on that on the 21st of this month, so that's like not very many days now, we will be publishing information about referrals in every area. They will be broken down by age, gender, disability indicator, ethnicity, primary health condition, lone parent status, etc., as geography as well. So we have deliberately waited until we have just enough to actually make it worth producing a statistical series. But having started doing that, we will then continually update that series.
So we can ask locally, we can ask our providers, and they will be able to provide us that locally from now. The unforeseen consequences perhaps of that, maybe not thought through. But if I go to my provider locally from the 21st, they'll be able to give me the local figures for Hackney South and Shoreditch, they'll be able to give the chair local figures for Barking and Dagenham, they'll give Mr Hancock his figures. Will that be broken down to that level? Mr Cave's nodding, that's fine. Yeah.
Well, so do it just maybe small, but so the statistics will show you geography by geography what the results are, right? And we're doing that properly to make sure that they are properly clean. I'm not expecting, actually, the providers to put this information as well. Their information is obviously coming into us, but you pay statisticians to make sure things are properly QA'd and all the rest of it.
But we'll be able to get it low. The point is
there will be local.
That's
yes, exactly.
That's good to know.
By local authority, parliamentary constituency and job centre plus districts. Every geography you can imagine.
Great. Well, you'll be getting a lot of questions from a lot of us, I think, when those... Yes, that's good. That is good news, actually, because the transparency is important. I mean, we have... It's a trend that government has been happening over governments from time to time. The private sector now provides a lot of public services, and yet we're hearing how hard it is sometimes to get information about where that pound goes. So there is an issue there, which I think is probably more than you can answer today. I think it's possibly for ministers. But if I go back to this issue about risks and you passing on the risk, you've emphasised over and over again, and it's been a debate in government for some time about passing the risk over. So what happens, one of the issues which your job is to look at the money partly, and we're here to look at the money, but I'm concerned about my constituents and what they're getting. If a prime contractor, and A4E is a prime contractor in my area, let's say A4E goes bust because it doesn't meet the target, it can't survive, what happens to those clients? You do a quick mini bid, but then what happens to them in the meantime? What happens?
So, well,
you have to pay an attachment fee again.
Okay. As well. In the first instance, the existing provider in the same locality will be asked to deal with those clients
immediately, overnight.
Like immediately.
How would they have the capacity? So just how would they have the capacity overnight to do that?
Okay.
I think this is not an inflexible business. I mean, you're talking about premises and people. Providers got from nothing to 100% start-up in the space of 3 months in getting a work programme started. So it is not, there is a lot of flex in the system. So we think that it is possible to transfer clients across. And it has been done in the past.
Okay. Jackie, Fiona, Steve, Richard.
In the previous session, we heard from Professor Finn about the fact that perhaps what was needed was minimum standards that users could expect. But having visited one of my work program providers, the message I was getting very much was that it was going to be successful where they could tailor a bespoke program of support for each individual claimant, because everyone has a different story, everyone has different challenges, and the moment you start designing processes that generate standards, then we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. From your perspective, Mr. Dutton, having heard what Professor Finn said, do you think there is any room for minimum standards in this programme, or would you be very much around the philosophy of bespoke support?
I do believe there is room for minimum standards in terms of the quality of the service that all of the people coming through the programme should accept and expect in terms of what happens. In terms of the way that minimum service level should be applied, I agree with the fact that if those are qualitative measures, then they need to be able to be measurable, which was really the question that was being asked. If those minimum service standards begin to control the way that we as providers, both prime providers and subcontractors, are able to operate our business, then I think we will genuinely be going backwards in terms of what is so exciting about the work programme, which is that we are able to tailor individual services for every single person that comes through the programme. So I think there is room for qualitative measures, but in terms of whether we have the flexibility and the freedom to work with that customer in the right way, I think has to be kept paramount at every stage of thinking that through.
The best measure is whether the person gets into work, and obviously your payment reflects that. To what extent are we looking for minimum service measures as a, let's say, an excuse for not delivering against that outcome, bearing in mind that the department are going to be looking at the performance and, you know, have the flexibility to you know, favour particular contractors if some are underperforming?
I think if, and it is an if, a minimum service level or standard was introduced, then that would have to be a conversation between all of the prime providers and our subcontractors with the department to determine whether that was appropriate. Whether that then changes the way that the services are delivered, or whether that changes how we're controlled, again, I think it comes back to the same answer, that flexibility remains paramount.
And for the department then, I mean, obviously you've transferred the risk, the financial risk to the providers, but you still own the policy outcome risk, which is delivering people into jobs. So from your perspective, what sort of indicators will you be looking at in terms of picking out where some providers aren't performing?
I mean, the first answer to that is that we have put contractually minimum performance levels in. So let's go back to pathways, which is the thing that you criticised us for previously. That achieved absolutely nothing more than would have been the case if the programme hadn't existed. The minimum contractual standard for ESA clients now is higher than deadweight. Okay, so if all I get for ESA claimants is the minimum performance standard, I will be ahead of where we have been previously, and I will be delivering you value for money. So fundamentally, as you said earlier, this is all about getting people into work, and that's essentially what we've achieved by having a programme which, particularly for those harder to help cases of the ESA caseload, you know, compared with previous programmes that achieved absolutely nothing, they're actually in a position now where actually the minimum contractual standard is higher than that.
So from your perspective, the fact that you've got the targets in the contract and the providers are bearing the risk, what we've got here is something which is really minimising the risk to the taxpayer in terms of delivering this outcome, and that you will be tough on those providers who don't hit those targets.
Well, there are two things that are going to happen. First of all, I mean, if in a particular environment contractor A starts to part company with contractor B in terms of performance, but they're both above the minimum standard, then actually they will start to lose market share, and that will hurt their profits. Yeah. If actually one of them starts to sink towards the minimum performance level, then actually, subject to, you know, various rules about getting performance plans and all this sorted out, we can take their contract off them. That is, you know, this is a really, in my view, really good contract.
Oh, no.
Isn't it true that providers can take £400 for a person and do effectively nothing?
No. Well, it's well, so what can I say? It is the case that we will pay £400 for an attachment. Okay?
Yes.
If that is all they do, they cannot make money on it.
No, I accept that.
And so the question is both sort of theoretical and practical simultaneously. I will pay the 400.
So you will pay 400 and someone
actually,
can do nothing for that 400.
Is a matter of they have to meet the minimum standards. Sorry, they have to meet the minimum standards. Okay, and if actually by the time we come to measure them against minimum performance in year one, they have not managed to achieve the minimum performance, which is above the non-intervention rate, we will be back on their case. So that there is it's twofold. I mean, we're only paying the attachment literally for the act of attachment, but the contract has got conditions in it about what actually happens to this minimum performance level.
Okay.
So it depends which year you're talking about. Although this minimum performance becomes contractually binding from, I think, year 3 onwards.
Mr Dutton, you heard Geraldine's evidence earlier and Professor Fans, and he was saying, both of them were saying, that we want granularity in assessing people. We want more accurate assessment. Do you do an assessment when people come to you?
Do. So irrespective of the benefit type that someone arrives into our programme, we do an immediate assessment to understand the needs of that individual. And in understanding those needs...
Am I right in thinking some people are much easier to help than others, even if they're in the same category?
Correct. The point that was being made is that the 8 categories that are currently there within the work programme and how they're paid for are a strong proxy for how much support those individual customers are likely to need. What you could see is a circumstance where someone had long levels of experience in terms of a 15-year CV, had fallen sick and ill for a period of time and returned to work, versus, for example, an 18-year-old who had no experience at all and no CV to support them into work. And therefore it may be easier to help the person who's on employment support allowance, who's got a 15-year CV and a great number of skills, than it might be the 18-year-old who doesn't. Yet the 18-year-old, in terms of the payment that he would receive, would be deemed to be easier to help than the person who's on employment support allowance.
Does your assessment feed your referral system? We know that the department refers blind to either. Does your assessment inform your referral to subcontractors?
In some instances, yes. So we have some subcontractors who work specifically in geographical areas, and we immediately just pass the referral straight on to them, and we have no intervention in that process in terms of that referral. We also have partners within our network who are specialist intervention partners. For example, they may be able to support us with people who have Asperger's syndrome. And we will look at that individual, assess them, and then pass them on specifically to that specialist provider.
Okay, and that will in effect cost you, as I understand it.
Correct. Obviously it will cost us money to make that initial assessment, hence why I do believe in certain circumstances where we are receiving a management fee, that's because we are undertaking work with that customer before we're then supporting them to then go on and get the specialist support they need from the great network of providers that we've got within our framework.
Right. Mr Dutton, I'm not accusing you of the accusation I'm about to make next, although I think your organisation might be guilty of it. So I want to address the whole issue of parking and creaming, because it seems absolutely clear to me that within these very broad categories, you put in your own language the fact that some people within the same category will be much easier to help, much more or less expensive for you to manage than the others. And it seems to me that there are 2 ways to make money here. One is to collect the £400 for everyone, the people who are utterly hopeless, to park them. You know, and actually it's quite possible with the minimum service standards that you're all signed up to for some organisations to park them completely. I mean, at least A4E says that your advisors have to be within 35 or 40 minutes travel, a measurable thing.
Correct.
Many of these things are absolutely unmeasurable at all. So the way to make money, it seems to me, is to park the ones that are too hard, put them into the too hard box, and to work on those who are in the margins. We know schools do this. We know schools do this to get people into the 5A to C's. And what I am concerned is that that's a really alienating experience for the people who end up being parked. And I don't see anything. I mean, I actually like the payment schedule in Figure 4 that says you get paid, you know, as you achieve milestones. I think that's a very sensible arrangement. But what I don't see, because, as we've heard, this doesn't reflect the real challenges of people, that within these categories, the challenges can be completely other than the payment reflects. What is there to reduce the risk of parking and creaming?
I think there are several things. Firstly, we as an organisation, as any prime provider and the subcontractors, have a duty to every single person that comes onto our programme. And we absolutely do make sure that they get the support that they require. My view about the way that this contract was led is that the financial mechanisms mean that it would be impossible for me and other organisations to make a profit if we only focus on those individuals who are easiest to help. Because the complexity of the model and the way that the model is constructed means that, notwithstanding the fact that you may have someone who's easier to help on employment support allowance versus someone who's harder to help, for example, in terms of job seekers allowance, we have to assess the needs of that individual, their distance from work, and then work with them to enable them into long-term employment. The great thing about the work programme is that we now have 2 years within which to do that. We also have additional mechanisms within the contract which really start to reflect the way that the current economics of business is working. So there was some debate earlier about the fact that there are employers who are working on zero-based hour contracts. There are part-time contracts. There are short-hour working contracts. One of the things that this contract now allows us to do for those people who may have been deemed to be harder to help is to continue to support them over 2 years, enable them to gain work experience and begin to count that activity towards their long-term sustainable employment. And therefore it's in our interest to try and get as many people as we possibly can into as much employed activity as we possibly can, because that's the way that the economics of this contract work. And so I do understand and I recognise the fears that people have about parking and creaming, but I genuinely believe, notwithstanding again that I operate a significant number of contracts in Australia, that the mechanism that the DWP has put in place in this instance means that we as providers have to perform, and if we don't perform, we don't get paid.
What it doesn't do, and I'd like to ask Mr. Devereux this, what it doesn't do is it doesn't, the payment doesn't necessarily reflect very accurately the risk and the challenge of individual people. And I was wondering whether you had considered, there are a couple of things which this report makes me think, if I'd been running it, I would have considered. One of them is I would have considered bunging a bit of money into the appeal system for ESA claimants so that you got them through the system quicker, and I'd be interested to know why you didn't. The other thing, it seems to me, that I'm surprised you haven't considered is whether it would be appropriate to make the initial assessment so that you got more accuracy, so that these categories were less crude, less inaccurate, so that you could reduce the risk of parking and creaming, because it really does actually alienate constituents at both ends. I've had complaints about providers in my constituency, both from people who feel that they are well qualified and just need one little extra thing, which they end up not being able to get because someone thinks that they can sort it out themselves, or the people who feel that they're being parked and feel very frustrated by it.
Okay, I do understand that. I mean, this set of prices is, as has just been said, begins to move us in the space of actually trying to reflect some of the average difficulty. Okay?
I like the payment.
But actually, I quite like the example you gave because it's really quite difficult to know, unless you're down to the individual, whether actually that young person is actually really rather more difficult than the seemingly really difficult sick person. Right? And I guess you have to ask yourself the question of this. I mean, is it pragmatic to think that actually the rate at which I'm going to pay is going to be based on a subjective assessment of whether this person is easy or hard? Whose assessment? Mr. Cave's? The providers? Some third-party judge? The reality is we've got to work with a system that's going to put millions of people through here, that we've actually got to think about something that's actually got a bit of a structure that moves us in the right direction. So everything that we've done here takes us really a long way forward compared with where they are. If you ask me the question, could I conceive of something even better? Well, probably, but it's be a lot more complicated, and you couldn't possibly get there without the knowledge that we're going to get out of this contract now. So,
okay.
so let's come back when we have some results.
So you
and we can
are
talk
going
about
to be, this is my final question, you are going to be trying to draw the knowledge out of this through, for example, getting responses from people who are on the programme to inform the way that it's delivered by different suppliers, and how are you going to make some of that public?
I think there are two things. I mean, you heard Professor Finn earlier on talking about the evaluation programme, which is going to start and which will have a very large sample of actual individuals going through the programme, and a big data set will come out of that, and it will be repeated during the course, so it's not a one-off, it will be repeated during the course of the programme. There's a bit which Professor Finn also referred to, which is, well, what about the more regular sampling of individual? And we are doing some of that. I mean, the focal work in the contract management of this are already looking at 1,000 individuals each month in relation to the minimum service standards, but also in relation to what their experience has been in terms of getting jobs. So that will generate a lot of information. It's not the case to think that by letting these contracts we've become blind to what's been going on. There'll be a lot of data.
Will you publish that? Which was the last
yes, I'm sure we will. Yeah.
Richard.
I've just got a couple of quick questions. Mr. Cave, one presumes in the design of this model that some providers will be more successful than others. You talked about gaps opening up. Are you happy or content, or are you expecting that there will be some sort of consolidation, shakeout, some contractors being more successful than others, to the point where some just move in and take over the space occupied by others, so that there will end up being fewer providers than on day one?
We don't have a plan or a target for this. I think it is likely that there will be difference in performance between providers, and the dynamics of a contract are such that that might lead to some considerably performing better than others. That would be a plus. What we've done in designing the letting of the contracts and the framework is to give ourselves the maximum protection against a consolidation in the industry which would be too rapid and too complete. So we've got 35 organisations on the framework. We've got 18 delivering the current set of contracts. Now, you've got to have an awful lot of concentration before we get into a position where...
18 primes.
18 primes, yeah.
Now, Mr. Dutton, you're one of the primes. How many people are covered under the contract that you've got in total?
In terms of the
in terms of people whom you're going to be seeking to help?
In terms of the contract that I have with the DWP right now, I'm afraid I can't provide you that information in this meeting. As the DWP said, the data that's going to come available in terms of number of people attaching to the programme will be published in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah. So we'll be able to see how many attachment payments you get.
Yes, you will. Yes.
Which will be a proportion of the total whom you have. So we'll be able to see whom you... at least correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understood you just to say is that where you succeed in getting somebody placed and get the initial attachment payment, we'll be able to see the total number of those, but we won't be able to see, from what's going to be published in a few weeks' time, what that is a proportion of. In other words, what the total was of which you got attachment payments for some. Is that correct?
No, you're going to get referrals and attachments.
Right. So we will know how many people have been referred in total to A for E.
Yes.
Right, but you can't tell me today.
I can't. No.
Right. Okay. Second question. You said 87% of the company is owned by one person, one individual. How many shareholders are there altogether?
There are 5 shareholders altogether.
How much do you own?
Pardon?
How much do you own?
I don't own any of the company.
You don't own any of the company?
No, I own no shares in the company.
You have no shares in the company at all?
No.
Okay. The turnover of the company, I think, did you say you have a profit of 4%?
Our net profit over the last year, yes, was 4.5%.
So if the company, that's the profit after tax?
Yes.
Yes. If the turnover of the company is 180 million pounds of your UK contracts, then the implication of that is that the profit from that 180 million pounds is going to be around 7 million, just over 7 million, and that 87% of that will be ascribed to the one individual who owns 87% of the shares. Is that right?
The calculations that you've just made are not correct in terms of the way that would work, and I think it's important to note that where profits are made, profits are also reinvested back into the business and not necessarily just taken in dividends. I think in terms of value for money, The question for me is that this is an outcome-based contract. A4E will be paid on the outcomes that it delivers, and it will only be successful going forward on the outcomes that we deliver, and we absolutely welcome that. Therefore, the success of our shareholders and the success of the business becomes more dependent on the outcomes that we deliver for the people that come through our programme.
Yeah, Mr. Devereux is nodding here, and I think we all favour rewarding performance, but I have a slight concern. I'll tell you what it is. In the coal miners' compensation contract, there was a solicitor in Doncaster, a partner of a firm in Doncaster, who paid himself a salary, a stress salary of £16.9 million. And the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Trade and Industry confirmed to us when we had the hearing that it wasn't the plan, wasn't the intention of the programme, wasn't the designed output of the programme to make certain solicitors in Doncaster into multimillionaires, but it was nonetheless the result that we got. And you talk about the economics of the programme and the economics of the marketplace and employers changing their requirements and their demand for labour. Of course, the way they will change their demand for labour is to some extent influenced by this enormous truck coming down the road with all these people who may be placed for whom there are a series of payments. So it is influencing the market in itself. And I just fear, and hope I'm wrong, that the opportunities to game the system may end up being sufficient that some people may end up making a very great deal of money without having necessarily achieved substantially or spectacularly different outcomes. Now, reassure me that I'm wrong.
I genuinely do not believe that that is the case. In the modelling that we undertook to take on the work programme, where significant risk has been passed to providers, that we have to make sure that we are performing across all groups in terms of the cohorts that come into the programme to generate strong profitability. And the great thing about the work programme is that if we are generating strong profitability, then the only way that we can do that is by having placed significant numbers of people who are out of work into long-term sustainable employment. And therefore, if the company is gaining, more importantly, the individual has gained long-term sustainable employment. And even more interestingly is that from the AME saving, the Dell savings that are made, the benefit to the Treasury in terms of how the report's constructed it is very significant.
Steve, Meg, and then I've just got a few things we haven't covered, which I'll come
You
back
said in reply to Mr. Bacon you would only get paid if there's a successful outcome.
Right. Well, we get,
but don't you get your management fee paid on the attachment?
Sorry. The majority of our payments, so as you can see in the report,
but you do get paid.
Up to 86% of our payments will be based on outcome, and in 3 years' time, all of our payments will be based on outcome.
I'm just clarifying that wasn't correct.
Sorry.
Okay. So I just wanted to come back to that 12.5%, and we can clarify whether it's 25% or 12.5%, but taking it 12.5% for the management fee, what is it we're actually getting for that? Because it just struck me that much of it should be automatic. If you pay the automatic electronic transfer in terms of the payment, the management of the relationship with DWP, it's pretty opaque as to what that is. So for that 12.5%, could you spell out to us as lay generalists what actually that covers?
I can. So it does cover some of the administrative costs that A4E have to undertake as a prime contractor, both, for example, in terms of auditing our own partner network itself, because we have very significant obligations to ensure that our partners undertake the services that we've asked them to undertake. We also, on their behalf, manage the relationship with the department. We also manage the contract and contractual changes of where they may occur, and equally, we go and represent ourselves.
Contractual changes?
So, for example, if there is new provider guidance that comes into the way that we need to manage customers that come from the DWP, then clearly we manage that information into our provider network. So that doesn't come directly from the DWP to the subcontractor, it comes into us as prime contractors.
So if DWP come along and say we want to change things on the contract, you're not going to come back and say, well, there's an additional cost for making those changes. You're actually absorbing that already front-ended, irrespective of what those changes are going to be within the management fee.
The way the contract works is that depending on the changes, they will go through a change control process. Both parties will impact that change, and if both parties deem that there needs to be a change to contract, there will be. If there isn't, there won't. So the statutorial changes, we are obliged to immediately implement those changes from DWP, and then retrospectively look at that impact. In addition to the things I've listed in terms of how we support...
Get clarity on that. So because Steve asked a really good question there. Would you, you know, I don't know what the terms of the contract are, would you be tempted to negotiate an increase in price? Would you not? That's what, you know.
At the moment, the contract that we are running and for the work programme is performing as we would expect it, and we have no reason to suggest...
If there's a change, would you try? Might you be tempted to negotiate an increase in price?
I think the question would always be, what is the change?
You wouldn't rule it out?
I wouldn't rule it out depending on the change.
I think that's where we want to be.
So I'm still confused as to what actually then...
If I may finish in terms of the additional services that we provide. So for example, we also work very hard with national employers and regional employers to get dedicated vacancies that are specific for the people that are working our programmes and down to our subcontractors. So for example, we have signed national contracts with Asda, the Royal Mail, the Tussauds Group, Greggs the Bakers and WH Smith, where those vacancies are specific to A4E, and we will also, where we can, provide those vacancies out to other organisations.
How are those contracts different to the ones Tesco may have signed with other providers?
It depends on how they have done. We don't have a specific contract with Tesco, but for example, with some of those providers, we are what's called a prime provider, and therefore the vacancies will come through A4E, and we will then manage those vacancies out into our own.
I'm just trying to get to the value added for the, you know, so you're saying, well, actually one of the things we're doing is, instead of the chair's point about local charities having relationships with their local supermarkets or whatever, we actually have gone nationally and we have negotiated a value added contract. I just find it surprising that Tesco, if we've got 18 providers, Tesco would have 18 different ones with each of the providers.
Well, that is absolutely the point. They won't necessarily do that. And for some of the very large organisations that we've contracted with, we are what's termed a master vendor. And for those vacancies that they want to put into the network for unemployed people through the work programme, all those vacancies will come through A4E. We will effectively manage them into our own network of branches and into our subcontractors. And where appropriate, what those large organisations have also asked us to do is make sure that those vacancies become available to the regions in which we don't operate. There is significant cost in us negotiating those contracts on behalf of ourselves and on behalf of our supply network.
Have you got a contract with like that?
We have, for example, as I just listed, we have contracts with, for example, Asda, the Royal Mail, the Tussauds Group.
And you're the only ones?
In some of those instances, we are the only ones. In others,
which one are you the only one with?
I would need to come back to you on the exact detail in terms of where we're the only.
Well, I'd like a note on that, because I mean, back to my knowledge locally, frankly, my local providers have got relationships with the local Asda and the local Tesco and the local etc., etc. They don't need you. They don't need you.
And just coming back to Mr. Bacon's point, I fully accept there's no guarantee 100% dividend would be paid. But if, on the figures you gave earlier, if 100% dividend was paid, then that would equate to £6.264 million from the taxpayer going to just one individual, being your company.
For an individual who has owned a business for 21 years and has at times taken no dividends, at times ploughed her own cash as a primary shareholder back into that business, and when businesses are successful, shareholders are entitled to take dividends.
And I don't dispute that. I was just, yes, I guess, I'm just trying to get, coming back to the earlier, just working out the numbers, it equates to 6.26. This is the management fee attached to helping the vulnerable.
I'm very happy to come back for what we've reported in our management accounts to make those available to the committee and come back and say exactly what those figures are.
Richard, very quickly, and then Emma. Sorry, then.
Very quickly, Mr. Dutton. Who is the main shareholder?
The main shareholder of A4E is Emma Harrison.
Emma Harrison.
Emma Harrison.
I was surprised when you said that you're not one of the 5 shareholders. You're the group's CEO for A4E.
I am.
Do you have any financial interest in any entity that obtains financial benefit from the A4E contract with DWP?
I, as an individual, am remunerated in line with the market. I have potential share options if and only when there is an event where shares are sold on behalf of the company. So I have an interest over them for which I have had to personally pay, but in terms of...
You've bought share options?
Effectively, I buy share options, yes.
When you say effectively,
It's a private company, so
Yes.
it's not quite the same as a
No.
public limited entity.
Yeah.
But effectively what I do is I pay money over to the company for those shares.
Sorry, could you just repeat that last bit? I didn't quite catch it.
I pay money over for those shares,
Yes.
and ostensibly then hold those shares, but it's a private company, and therefore realisation of anything depends on how the majority shareholder manages.
When you say you pay money over for those shares, you mean you pay money over for the opportunity to
Correct.
purchase those shares
Correct.
at a point in the future, subject
Correct.
to the conditions that are laid down in the
Correct.
option.
I think going back again to value for money from the work programme, we as an organisation going forward are going to be paid by results. There is some attachment fee accepting, but the majority of the revenue that we will generate from the work programme, in excess of 80% and moving to 100% over the life of this contract, is based on the performance that we and our subcontractors will deliver over the life of that programme. And that's really the value for money question that I think the committee is considering.
So you do have skin in the game, but it's because, and not because you're a shareholder at the moment, it's because you've put your own money up to buy buy share options, essentially.
Yes.
How much have you had to spend on buying share options?
I think it's a private matter between myself and the company in terms of how much I have paid for shareholding. And the real issue is about the value for money of the work programme and how we're going to be paid going forward, and that's what the committee is here to understand.
I'll tell you what's interesting about this, and you know, sorry to subject you to it, but you're one of the first examples we've had of a company which is entirely dependent on public contracts for your existence, and therefore you move, in our view, into a new. It's not being sort of aggressive, but you move into a new arena. Because we value, in terms of looking for value for money, have an interest in following the pound into a company which is entirely, all your business is public contracts, whether it's DWP, Home Office or wherever. It's entirely public contracts. And I think you and your Emma Harrison have to accept that that will mean that will be a different relationship and a different interest in the remuneration and profits made, because the profits you make come from the taxes that ordinary people pay, hard-working people pay.
I do accept that, and we as a company, in terms of the revenues that we generate from the work programme, will, for a majority of case, only be paid when we are successful.
That's
and being
not the point,
successful
though.
means putting
That's
people
only
into
part
work.
of the equation. That's really what we're saying. Emma.
I was wanting to ask Mr. Devereux if, in the contract, there is any requirement on companies to minimum financial reporting on companies about their profits, other than what they file at Companies House.
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, if you don't know the answer, you can perhaps give us a note.
You'll have to send you a note.
Because you're guardian of taxpayers' money in this case, and it would be seen to me a possible option.
Yes, it is. I mean, remember, of course, it is the case for the company you just described. I mean, we have let contracts based on a competition. So different parts of the market have looked at the value of this contract. They made their own assessment about what the profit margin is, and therefore produced the discount. So, I mean, I can sleep soundly in bed thinking, actually, because I managed to produce enough people to bid for this. It was a very healthy competition, because I know that actually they were bidding good prices for it. Actually, I've got some confidence. Now, that's not the same as saying I'm then also looking over their shoulder and working out exactly what the share option deal are. But you know, I've put this into a competitive market.
I'm less worried about the individual sort of the absolute detail of a share option than I am just to see what that turn of profit is on the taxpayer's pound as the chair highlight. And then just one quite important point picking up from Fiona Taggart's points about some of the existing 0 hours contracts. Now I speak to people in my constituency who do these 5-hour shifts and do a couple of those, or what short hours in schools or whatever. But for those people that you're placing, Mr. Dutton, you're paid if they're working 20 hours a week or more. Is that right? Or is it 16 hours?
If they're working 16 hours, every day that they accumulate in work will ultimately go towards a long-term sustainable payment, yes.
So just to be clear, so if you were placing me in a job tomorrow, it would have to be minimum 16 hours on a week.
Yes.
Every week for the period of while you're at work.
3 or 6 months, absolutely.
Which, if we're looking positively at this, could mean that we see an end to some of the 0 hours contracts, actually, although I can see the point Fiona Taggart was raising about current people in those jobs. But is this actually a way that the department is going to effectively enforce employees to contracts of 16 hours a week?
I'll Alan give you the detail, but we are paying for 16 hours in work, which is not the same as the existence of a 16-hour minimum contract.
Okay, I'm sorry,
the people who had 0 hours contracts got 16 hours every week, they'd be very happy, let me tell you.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I'm just, this is the difference between the form and the substance of the contract. I mean, what we are paying for is 16 hours paid employment in a week. Right? We are not asking a question about what was the nature of the contract, which could have been a 0-hour contract, but nonetheless generates reliably 16 hours.
If someone's regularly getting 16 hours on a flexible contract, that's for a lot of them.
Quite good business.
Yes. But it means that if you're on the work programme, you're definitely going, if you're a graduate of the work programme, provided to get the money, there has to be a 16 hours a week work.
A JSA person would have had to have had 26 weeks and worked 16 hours in every one of those 26 weeks, whatever the nature of their contract.
Which is better than a lot of my constituents are currently getting, which is
good.
Which could be, if we, yes. Are you going to be monitoring that stays on beyond?
Well, that's exactly what Alan's team is for.
Can I just ask some, I think, cleaning up questions that we haven't covered?
Yeah.
One is, we've had quite a lot of it on the primes. And I've seen in the some of the literature I've read before today that feel that perhaps you should regulate the primes more, to ensure that they don't simply pass on the risk to the subcontractors, that they do refer people on. The Kivo survey, which suggested they didn't, that they don't cherry pick, that they do use the voluntary sector in the way that Francis Maud promised they would, so that the voluntary sector gets 35 to 40%. And actually this issue of profits, and let me just say to you, it may be that, you feel we're being overly sensitive here, but we're dealing with PFI and the legacy of PFI. And one of the issues that has arisen out of that has been that, the previous government ought to have put into place measures to ensure that excess profits at the expense of the taxpayer weren't enjoyed. So there are all those issues around primes, and I just wondered what plans or what thoughts you had about regulating.
Okay. I mean, just on the very last point you made, I mean, I absolutely agree that you will want to look at that. I mean, we are deliberately incentivising people to overachieve, and the way they overachieve is by making more profit. And I'm not actually going to, relate from that. I mean, I positively want people to get into bonus territory. We haven't even talked about bonus territory. If they get to 30% above the non-intervention rate, I'll pay more money. That will be profitable, seriously profitable. And actually, that's the nature of a market. I mean, that's what we've deliberately put in place here. So the level of profit is there to drive performance. Now, if you think that, by capping that off at some number, I will still get constant upward pressure, including for some of the colleagues, some of the customers that you've been talking about, then we'll have a different view of this from the way the government's gone about it. Just going back to the bit about the prime, do you want to say something about the subcontractors?
Yes, I mean the way in which we manage the relationships within the supply chains, I think, are first things we have already done. So we put a requirement on all bidders to be very explicit about the delivery mechanism they have in the supply chain, so we're bringing to bear, and the appropriateness of those supply chain arrangements. We required a signed letter from each subcontractor to confirm that they had agreed the terms on which the bid was being put forward to us. The supply chains can flex, and indeed they will flex in line with performance, as some do better and some do worse. So some subcontractors will get more business and some will get less, but that flexing will take place at our approval and on a performance basis. And when we have the Merlin standard, all primes are being accredited between now and June, and that will be the check that the promises they have made in their bids and in their contracts with their subcontractors are being maintained, and that accreditation will involve detailed discussions and interviews with a wide range of the subcontractors, and indeed subcontractors who didn't get slots with those particular prime contractors.
But one of the reasons for having the primes...
Well, it's better than the Stars and Stripes forever, anyway.
One of the reasons for having the primes was that you felt it was better to have large organisations bearing the risk, and that they shouldn't pass on the that risk to smaller organisations, as I remember the justification for going for big... am I wrong about that?
I mean, it's certainly the case that we were interested in having that. I mean, some the subcontractors positively want the incentivisation. So I've met some of the subcontractors who actually, want to have, as I think some of the A4E ones, the payment. They don't want it discounted. So I don't know what it is that makes us think that all of the subcontract chain sort of doesn't want to be in an incentivised world. Some may, but I mean, we're given these primes.
No, I understand. Of course we want, but you're just.
I'm not requiring them to
pass
it on.
They're frustrated about the Merlin standards not being fixed for a bit yet, isn't that one of the issues? And that's probably a product of starting it fast.
No, it was always, the timetable was always that we were going to get the work programme up and running and then take a detailed look after it had been going for 9 months to a year, so we had a proper review of how the subcontracting arrangements work. There was no point in doing it in the first few months because we wouldn't have had a proper picture of it.
Just cleaning up. I'm trying to clean up the things we haven't. ESA claimant referrals down, we were told by the people who gave evidence before you did, by 60% again. I don't know if that's a correct figure, but is that a deliberate policy? Why is that happening? And clearly there's more money by if you put an ESA claimant into work.
So the projection we made in December showed a 30% smaller number for ESA referrals to the work programme compared with the projections we put out in June, 30% over the life of the whole programme. And the big driver for that is the evidence emerging from the way in which work capability assessment is dividing people between the three categories for people who are fit for work, the people who are going to the support group and the people in the work-related activity group, and also the length of prognosis which it's giving people before they're fit to back to work. So it does seem that there is a different structure to the ESA group as compared with the JSA group than was initially projected. That's just on the basis of experience. In addition,
delay in appeals.
Sorry?
Isn't part of this?
There is an issue which we're working through at the moment to speed up the impact of the Professor Harrington changes, which have led to some delays in the way in which the assessment process has taken place. And we have got some issues internally, as ever, to make sure our processes work more slickly and get people moving through more speedily to the right point.
Okay, and the final thing that I think we haven't got, and then Richard's got as a very, very final one, is having got to one work programme, we're now seeing the emergence of other programmes. And I just wondered how the relationship was being developed. The youth contract, how that sits with the work programme, and the troubled families programme unit, I don't know what it's called, are two, sadly, outside the work programme, and I just wondered how on earth that was working.
Well, two opposition to that. I mean, the work programme is for a defined class of people, and we haven't changed that class, so those people will still
Some
go
of the
through
troubled families, the troubled families are bound to be within the classes that could be in the work programme.
The work programme is still there. Some of the things that we've been discussing, and actually Alan is now leading a group across Whitehall to make sure that we make payment by results as widely available as possible, is actually what's the best way to do the additional work that family support stuff is going to be getting into. So that we are not going to be sort of paying for employment outcomes through anything to do with working to the 120,000 families, when actually they are already, as you observe, likely to be candidates for the work programme. There are other things that we may well want them to do. I mean, if we potentially, we're hoping to get truancy rates down, for example, then that would be something well worth doing. It wouldn't score in this contract, but we're deliberately trying to spread the knowledge we've got of running payment by results into other areas.
But so the individual and the individual family will be accessing a number of programmes. They'll be accessing DWP or the contractor through the work programme.
One of the reasons for constructing the work on 120,000, actually, there are an inordinate number of things impacting on their lives, and trying to get your handle on exactly what's the best way in which these families can best be supported is deliberately why Louise Casey's going off to do that work.
And the youth contract?
The youth contract is within the work programme. The youth contract, for work programme purposes, is a subsidy available to an employer who takes on a work programme participant into work. So it's for a young person. It's a way of giving an employment subsidy to a young person on the work programme.
And how is it better value than the Future Jobs Fund? Because what's the difference between that and... I mean, I'm literally really interested, because Robert Devereux was pretty good at saying the Future Jobs Fund wasn't value for money. How's this going to be different to make it value for money?
So if you want to have a conversation about the youth contract, can we write you a note, because we've come to talk about the work programme? Sorry,
no,
I
it's
simply haven't mugged it up.
Well, I think that's a way of evading an answer, if I may say so.
The
work programme is about getting people into work. We suddenly find, we thought it covered everybody, we've suddenly got this new youth contract, and which feels to me, and I'm not a great expert on it, that it's a little bit similar to what the Future Jobs Fund was. It's not. What is it?
It's not.
So youth contract's got a number of components. One, most of it is actually aimed at people below the age at which they get onto the work programme. So it's actually designed, a lot of it's designed for NEETs. So it's...
16 to 19s?
Indeed. And so it is 16 to 18s in many cases. And so it's a combination of additional work experience places, additional work inside Job Centre Plus, with young people coming on to JSA in the first 6 months.
Same providers that have got contracts?
No, there are no additional contracts for the youth contract, other than some contracts which will be let for 16 to 18-year-olds, in other words, before JSA, for which is a DFE letting.
And will that be a payment by results one?
It will be a payment by results contract, yeah.
Richard, very finally.
Very quickly. Mr Devereux, we've not really talked about the universal credit at all, and indeed paragraph 322 says the Department does not anticipate the need to make significant changes to the programme and will make any changes necessary over the next 12 to 18 months' time. The Chair says sotto voce rubbish. I've no idea whether this is true or not, but can I just ask you, should it prove necessary to make changes, based on the law of unintended consequences, it's quite possible there will be some changes. What are the changes that you think might be required what might the impact be of the universal credit on all of this?
If you start your question with the premise, should it be necessary, and at the moment, what the report is accurately recording.
Indeed, I read it out, but I'm just wondering.
We worked up the work programme quickly because we wanted to get the work programme in place. It is much better than previous programmes. In parallel, and it's a much more complicated thing, we are designing universal credit. It's now largely through the House of Commons. We'll then think about whether there is anything else.
Yeah, I'm just asking, have you, I mean, you must have given some thought to where it might bite.
Well, I haven't actually, no, because actually I'm in the middle of, I've already got contracts out there running this. Universal credit will start to come along in the autumn of 2013. In the grand scheme of things, which you and others are asking me to do, this is in the, I can manage this at a later date. Yeah.
And the piloting for that, the computer testing, is still scheduled to start in April 2013.
It is,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Mr Cave, just very finally, you're the SRO. In relation to the work programme, what keeps you awake at night?
I sleep pretty well as a general rule, actually, to be honest. I think the things we've been talking about today, actually, we are all thinking about what the impact of the economy is on people who are unemployed, and whether we're giving them the best support that we can. I mean, I think that's what we want to see. So, I hope I wouldn't be thinking about much else, actually.
I'm glad that we're in the same territory. At the end of the session, if not right at the beginning. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for your patience as well. We've gone on much longer. Thank you.